Once when I was young, I volunteered for a hatchery in the harbor off the Long Island Sound. This specific hatchery didn't release turtles or fishes or birds, it actually released oysters. Now you ask, why oysters? And I'll admit I asked the same question. As it turns out, oysters have the ability to filter out a few toxins generated by pollution, which is why the organization worked very diligently on releasing them back into the wild. As you can imagine, a 10-year-old me was very excited to see these oysters and, more importantly, the pearls inside of them. And I had to say, I was very disappointed when I realized the oysters were only about this big. Not yet completely discouraged, however, I went up to one of the workers and I demanded to know where the pearls were. He laughed and said the oysters were much too small to have pearls. He explained to me that when a pearl was made, the oyster opens up its shell, and a grain of sand floats in and lands on the inside of the oyster. The oyster would find this grain of sand very irritating and would spit on it until it became round and smooth and it turned into a pearl. I used this newfound information to the best of my ability, and I tried to find an oyster that I could pry open and shovel sand into. Unfortunately, my ingenious plan didn't work. I never fully appreciated the term, "the world is your oyster," until after this, because in truth, some oysters are very small. Funny enough, a few years later, my English teacher decided to analyze a poem, and this phrase was referenced in it. She explained how it was an idiom, and that meant you should take advantage of the opportunities given to you. I was shocked. This interpretation was not what I had in mind. I'd always assumed from my past experience that with that oyster farm, that some people's worlds are much smaller than others and some were much larger, and it was up to their actions to decide the size. This paradigm shift threw me because I had to reevaluate my own conception of the idiom. This realization always served me well because it was one of my first encounters with seeing from two different perspectives, especially in terms of literature. Literature transformed me because it was one of the ways I was able to discover and understand different perspectives in life. Reading was a place where I could see from someone else's eyes, and I realized not everyone saw or read the same way. Because of the many books I have read throughout my life, my world has grown and continues to grow bigger and bigger each day. In literature, you find authors who tend to want to break barriers and socially accepted trains of ignorance. They want you to see what they see, whether it be in settings of fantasy or settings of nonfiction. They want you to stretch your horizons farther so that you will be able to see the world from different perspectives, and ones that you might not be fully aware of. And by making you see it, you cannot unsee it. You become more consciously aware of it. This awareness, in turn, expands your own horizons, your own world, and your own perceptions. This transforming awareness, through the power of literature, is clearly portrayed in the novel To Kill a Mockingbird and the movie Hidden Figures under the lenses of feminist critical theory and critical race theory.
Feminist critical theory is a social theory that analyzes literature and accounts for the oppression and overall role of women in literature. Feminist critical theory focuses on gender equality and challenging existing distributions of power, according to Deborah L. Rode in her journal Stanford Law Review. In his journal on Feminism in American Literature, Andrew P. Barker adds that the theory also focuses on viewing literature from a woman's perspective and an accurate reflection of their experiences. Meanwhile, critical race theory analyzes the intersection of race within law, power, and society. As stated in a primer on critical race theory compels us to confront critically the most explosive issue in American civilization, the historical centrality and complicity of law in upholding white supremacy. It addresses the subjectivity of perspective with regards to truth, fairness, and justice as caused by the mindset, status, and experience of the dominant faction.
To Kill a Mockingbird is a novel written by Harper Lee about a small town in Alabama during the 1930s. To Kill a Mockingbird broke barriers when it was published in 1960, addressing rising issues of feminine identity and racial equality. The novel spans the early childhood of Jim and Scout Finch and the events that affect and change them throughout the years. Scout Finch, the main character, is a young girl trying to discover her identity in a society that is constantly trying to mold her into a perfect feminine model. One of the major plot lines of the novel is the trial of Tom Robinson, a falsely accused black man presumed to have raped a white woman. Atticus Finch, Jim and Scout's father, is entangled in this when appointed as the lawyer to defend Tom Robinson. Through this trial, Scout and Jim are exposed to the issue of racism that permeates the world around them. Being a young, inexperienced girl, Scout is unaware of the racism that surrounds her in her town. She is blind to the world she lives in, but throughout the novel, she begins to slowly become aware of the racial issues in her town. Through her eyes, the reader also becomes aware of the oppression and injustice towards the African American population that was common in southern towns at the time. The main tenets of critical race theory that To Kill a Mockingbird addresses and emphasizes to the reader are institutionalized racism and white privilege. Institutionalized racism is when a dominant group of society restricts the opportunities of a minority race or group. This was extremely prominent in To Kill a Mockingbird, exemplified by one of the most significant parts of the novel, the trial of Tom Robinson. Because of Robinson's race, he automatically lost his case in court before it even began. Although he was given a lawyer, Atticus Finch, and therefore seemed like he was being given a real chance, it was all a hopeless illusion. Despite Atticus's strong defense in court, showing evidence for Tom's innocence, there was nothing that could save him because the court was determined from the start to condemn him. As Atticus said during his closing statements of the trial, a court is only as sound as its jury, and a jury is only as sound as the men who make it up. The white jury was fixedly against him because he was black in 1930s Alabama and they were white. White privilege also played into the racial injustice of the novel. The white people in court, like the Yules, were given instant credibility, while black men like Tom Robinson were not. Another example of white privilege was literacy. Most white people in the town could read and write, but it was much less common among the African American population. Calpurnia, the Finch's black housekeeper, was actually literate, but this was unusual for the times. She was only literate because she grew up on Finch Landing with Atticus and was able to benefit off their white privilege. When Calpurnia took the children to go to church at the black church, she had to change her civilized way of speaking to match the uneducated talk of the rest of her race. Jim and Scout, on the other hand, were both taught from a young age to read and write because they were white. They didn't understand why she talked differently with them because they didn't really understand the education differences between blacks and whites until she took them to church that day and they saw for themselves. Scout, as a tomboyish girl, raises much dissension in the town, especially from other female figures in her life, such as her prim and proper Aunt Alexandria. She has to learn to navigate her way in a world with strictly constructed societal views of females' roles that is trying to force the idea of different spheres on women. At the beginning of the novel, Scout, her brother Jim, and their friend Jill would constantly play together, but as time went on and they all became aware of the social constructions of gender roles, the boys began to exclude her from their games because she was a girl. Because of this, Scout began spending her evenings rocking on the porch with Miss Maudie, a much more suitable occupation for a girl. Another person who tried to force Scout into a certain gender role was her Aunt Alexandria, her father's sister, who came to live with them for a time in order to be a good feminine influence for Scout. She was the perfect feminine model and desperately wanted Scout to be the same, constantly battling Scout's tomboyish tendencies and trying to force her to be something she was not. Another person who tried to force her into a socially constructed role was her Uncle Jack. One day, Scout got into a fight with her cousin because he taunted Atticus and called him an in-lover, and this got her into big trouble with her uncle. She spanked her and told her that ladies don't do those kind of things. He asked her, "You want to grow up to be a lady, don't you?" Scout answered, "Not particularly." He said, "Of course you do." Females during this time were expected to be ladies with no exception, because that was what society had determined they would be. Scout had to deal with many different challenges as a girl that her brother Jim did not. As explained in Andrew Barker's article, A Gradual Approach to Feminism in the American Literature Classroom, To Kill a Mockingbird brings the issue of feminine identity and social constructionism to the attention of boys who would have never come in contact with these issues on their own. To Kill a Mockingbird brought the issues of racial equality and feminine identity to the surface and forces these problems to the forefront of the reader's mind, despite the fact that they might not actually affect them in their own lives. The novel broadens the mind of the reader and makes him or her see what it was truly like during this time period for minority races and women, even if it wasn't what they wanted to see.
A more modern portrayal of both the theories can be seen in the movie Hidden Figures. Hidden Figures follows the story of 3 black women who work at NASA during the civil rights movement and the space race in the 1960s. The film portrays the blatant inequalities faced by the black community during this time, from large to small defeats. Intersectionality is clearly portrayed in the movie, with the three main characters being part of more than one sphere. They are African American and women working in what is considered to be a white man's world. They are not just one or the other, they are both spheres intertwined. With Catherine, Dorothy, and Mary being part of two different spheres, they see from a very unique perspective. They become the minority of the minority. They face two different sides of discrimination, double the discrimination. Throughout the movie, there are blatant examples of racist actions or words towards the three main women, and by extension, the African American community in general. Actions and words like these are easy to pick out and notice when something is wrong with the way these women are being treated. But along with these obvious examples of racism, there are also many subtle examples of racist actions that often go unnoticed. One particular example is when everyone in the department room where Catherine works gives her strange glares when she uses the communal coffee pot. The bigger aggression occurs the next day when suddenly there is a new, smaller, empty coffee pot with a sticker saying "colored" on it. Another example of a racial microaggression occurs throughout the movie rather than one specific instance. The supervisor for the white computing group, Mrs. Mitchell, always refers to Dorothy Vaughan as just Dorothy. Even though they have the same job position in theory, Mrs. Mitchell never refers to Dorothy Vaughan as Mrs. Vaughan. The simple act of not using proper etiquette towards another woman of equal standing showed the hidden prejudice that was buried deep in the relations between white and black women of the times. Microaggression in regards to feminism plays a key role in the film, with the characters facing backhanded comments and offensive physical reactions. The terms "wasn't designed for a woman" and "that's not a place for a woman" and "that's pretty heavy stuff for a woman" undermine a woman's ability to perform. Terms like this discriminate between men and women, creating an unnecessary divide between them. The film uses the phrase "that's just the way it is" several times, reiterating over and over the social construct that culture and the norm are permanent, that things can't be changed no matter how unjust those things are. The phrase "that's just the way it is" is not unique to Hidden Figures. This phrase is often used in everyday life by people who are unwilling to bend or change to accommodate groups of people who are oppressed. Microaggression and other discriminatory actions often go unnoticed when they are not directed at or towards a person's gender, class, or race. To prove this point, we decided to perform an experiment on some of our closest male friends. We were curious to discover how different their way of processing the film was compared to ours because of their different life experiences as males. So once we got them all together, we didn't tell them what they were doing, why they were there, or anything of the nature. We just told them we needed their help. So when we started the movie, we let them have their natural reactions as the movie went along. Most of them had never seen it except for only one. After the movie, we gave them a sheet of questions for them to answer individually. The questions were things like, what was the most memorable part of the movie for you? Who was your least favorite character? Who was your favorite character? Who did you identify with? And did you notice any examples of microaggression within the film? After we got to this question, most of our friends needed to be given a definition of microaggression. So we gave them the definition, and then we gave them an example in the film. So the example we gave them was whenever there's a white woman standing at the white water fountain along with her child, and then there's an African American man walks up to the colored water fountain right next to it. When he walks up, the woman pushes her child out of the way, so the child is farther away from the African American man. Once we gave them that example of the aggression, they understood and moved on. After discussing the questions and everything with them, we came to the conclusion that they noticed a lot more of the obvious feminist and racial microaggressions rather than the more subtle ones. They noticed things like the colored bathrooms versus the white bathrooms, the coffee pot incident that we talked about earlier, and a scene where a police officer stops and talks to our three main characters in the beginning of the movie and makes racial and feminist aggressions towards them. They didn't notice things like how Miss Mitchell would never call Dorothy Mrs. Vaughan, giving her the same respect that Dorothy gives her, and in the movie where there's an incident where the workers have to start working overtime and their boss tells them to call your wives even though there are women in the room. This further reiterates our point of how a person is generally not going to notice the aggressions that don't relate to them. Another thing we noticed is that their answers would normally start off well with the right idea, but then we would quickly find that their reasoning was flawed in terms of the two theories. So for one example, Catherine has an explosion scene basically where she has to run a half mile every time she needs to go to the bathroom because there are no colored bathrooms in her building. So whenever they were giving an example of, or giving their reasoning behind if it was justified or not, they said, yes, the boss needed to know how bad Catherine's situation was. But they also said that he needed to know how bad Catherine's situation was for her to be more efficient, not for her to have the same dignity and respect that she should have as an African American woman. Another example would be theme. Whenever we asked them about the theme of the movie, most of them said race doesn't matter, but they also tacked on that race doesn't matter when we're working towards a common goal. But in a critical theory standpoint, race shouldn't matter at all. It shouldn't even be a factor. So as white females, we were more likely to notice the feminist aggression than the racial ones. So whenever we were watching it together, anytime there were feminist aggressions, we got very angry, very offended, just screaming at the television, just wanting it to stop. But whenever the racial aggressions were there, we noticed a lot of them, but we weren't as mad. We would think, oh yes, that's wrong, but we didn't have the experience to back it up. We were much more detached of, what was happening. So we probably also missed some of the more subtle things that someone who was black wouldn't miss. To further support this stance we've taken, take the example from my own personal life. Recently, our Dean of Women came into our history class to address several upcoming events. She was explaining our shoe requirements for graduation. Nude shoes only for graduation, no brown, no tan, flesh color. We want all of you to look like one flowing silhouette. Almost every girl in the class understood and moved on with their thoughts, already scrolling through their shoe collection. Unexpectedly, one girl raised her hand for clarification. So when you say flesh color, I have different colored flesh than you. Everyone turned and realized that nude meant a different color for her. She was African American. It was unlikely that anyone was consciously thinking about how a different color nude shoe was relevant to anyone in the class. I know I wasn't. We want to emphasize that this way of thinking isn't wrong, but it's not right either. The girl broadened our thinking into the difference in the word nude for different races and how the commonly referenced Caucasian nude is not the singular nude. She shifted our view. In this case, the dean and my class were likely only thinking about the aspects that affected ourselves. But what about the bigger picture? What about the world outside of ourselves? The one that we are not directly affected by. We remained fairly oblivious until it was brought to our attention. Now, anytime I hear the word nude when describing a color, I always think about this event and how it affects different people.
Both theories, feminist critical theory and critical race theory, are incredibly important when dissecting literature, particularly in their power to reveal what we tend to want to sweep under the rug and can't directly relate to. This is literature's most transformative power. Literature allows you to see from somebody else's perception that you might not have been able to see from originally. From this perception, you're allowed to relate differently to the topic, at times understanding it better, widening your horizons. Oppression, for example, has never been an easy topic to address, simply because it makes us uncomfortable. But this feeling of uncomfort and realization is exactly what the author intends. They write with such potency on such a controversial topic because they want their stories to make us feel, to make us see, and to make us regret, so that we can learn from the mistakes of others, whether real or fictional. They hope that by writing these stories, they will expose the readers to the world they see, along with all their faults, and that the reader learns and changes for the better because of it. They hope that by invoking these emotions, they will make their readers think, and then transfer these ideas and situations into their daily life, so that they will be able to see the world not only from their perspective, but an incorporation of these ideas and the reader's own. Literature is like a pearl, like the one I was so determined to find on the oyster farm so many years ago. It comes in grainy and irritating at first, drawn from the outside of your shell. Then it sits there and stays with you, building upon itself. Therefore, it's changing you from the inside out. By opening yourself up, you can have 3, 4, 5 pearls, even more if you like. Simply be open to the world outside your shell, and you'll find you'll be able to overcome the greatest adversary of all, understanding. Let us leave you with this quote by Edward Taylor in his article on critical race theory. One powerful way to challenge the dominant mindset of society, the shared stereotypes, beliefs, and understandings, is the telling of stories. Stories can not only change the status quo, but they can help build consensus and create a shared communal understanding. They can, at once, describe what is and what ought to be. Stories have the power to change the world, but the real question is, will you let it change you?